A ruthless millionaire publicly humiliated a young busboy for a small mistake, until a waitress with nothing to lose stood between them. "Your strength isn't in your voice," she said. "It's in your spine." What happened next silenced an entire five-star restaurant. He had money, power, and control. She had grit, dignity, and a quiet defiance that refused to bow. He tried to break her, but she revealed the cracks in him. What secret pain turned this tyrant into a ghost of a man? This is the story of a broken king, a fearless waitress, and the night everything changed. Let's dive into it. The last dregs of scotch swirled in Julian Croft's glass, amber light catching the facets of the heavy crystal. He stared into it, but he wasn't seeing the ridiculously expensive liquor. He was seeing a reflection of the restaurant, Aria, distorted and blurred, a fitting metaphor for the world he inhabited. It was a world of muffled laughter, of clinking silverware on bone china, and of people who existed only in the periphery of his vision. Figures to be served by, billed by, and forgotten. He tipped the glass back, the fiery liquid a familiar burn down his throat. It was a punishment he paid for nightly, a penance for a sin he could no longer name but could never forget. The sin of choosing profit over a promise, a deal over a drive home. From his secluded corner booth, he watched them all, his contempt a shield. The happy couples celebrating anniversaries they wouldn't remember next year, their laughter grating against his raw nerves. The business sharks, all teeth and tailored suits, closing deals on foundations of sand. And the staff, the worst of them all. They moved with a practiced, synthetic grace, their smiles as empty as the promises he made to himself in the dark of his sterile penthouse. Tonight, his gaze, sharp and cruel as a shard of broken glass, had landed on a young busboy, no older than 19. The boy had been clumsy, his hands too big for his body, his movements uncertain. A single water glass had slipped, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed to tear through the restaurant's polite hum. It was a minor infraction, a footnote in the evening's symphony of service. But to Julian, it was a screeching offense, a crack in the perfect, ordered world he paid so much to maintain. He had summoned the manager, his voice low and serrated, and eviscerated the boy's competence in front of the entire dining room. The boy's face, pale and stricken, had become the focal point of Julian's rage. It felt good, this precise, surgical cruelty. It was a distraction. It was power. It was anything other than the hollowness that consumed him. But then, she had appeared. A waitress he hadn't noticed before. She moved not with the rehearsed elegance of the others, but with a quiet, unhurried composure that felt profoundly out of place. She knelt, her back to Julian, and began picking up the larger pieces of glass, her movements deft and careful. She spoke to the boy, her voice too low for Julian to hear, but the effect was immediate. The rigid terror in the boy's shoulders eased. He took a breath, his composure slowly returning under her calm influence. She had given the boy a small, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity before standing and facing the manager, absolving the boy of the worst of the blame. She hadn't looked at Julian once. It was as if he, and his mountain of money, and his volcano of contempt, simply did not exist. This stunning act of quiet defiance, of simple human decency, was more infuriating than any argument. He felt a familiar, cold fury begin to coil in his gut. He would not be ignored. He would make her see him. He would make her understand that in his world, kindness was a liability he had long since liquidated. Ilara Vance felt the weight of the day settle into her bones, a dull ache that started in her feet and worked its way up to her soul. 2 back-to-back shifts at Aria, the city's temple of haute cuisine, was a marathon of forced smiles and aching arches. The money was good, essential even, but the cost was measured in more than just time. It was measured in the slow erosion of her spirit, one condescending diner at a time. Still, it was worth it. Every dollar was a step closer to finishing her art history degree, a lifeline to a world of beauty and meaning that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the starched linen and polished silver of Aria. Every paycheck helped keep the lights on in the small apartment she shared with her grandmother, whose quiet, steady love was the only anchor Ilara had ever known. Her grandmother, Elena, was a woman forged in a different era, one where dignity was not a commodity, but a core principle. "Never let them see you sweat, my little starling," she would say, her voice thin, but her words like steel. "Your strength is not in your voice, but in your spine. Keep it straight." Ilara carried those words with her like a shield, a silent mantra against the casual cruelties of the world. Tonight, her shield had been tested. The man in the corner booth, Mr. Croft, was a fixture at Aria. He was a creature of expensive habits and profound solitude, a man who seemed to take up more space than his physical form required, sucking the very warmth from the air around him. The other staff spoke of him in hushed, cautionary tones. He was a black hole of a customer, his tips lavish, his complaints merciless. He never raised his voice, which was somehow more terrifying. His displeasure was a cold, precise weapon. And tonight, he had wielded it against Marco, the new busboy. Ilara had seen the whole thing. Marco, a sweet kid saving up for community college, his hands trembling as he cleared a nearby table. The slip, the crash, the sudden sharp intake of breath from the surrounding tables, and then Mr. Croft, leaning forward, his eyes like chips of flint, summoning the manager with a flick of his wrist. He dismantled the boy, piece by piece, with a quiet, venomous monologue on the importance of competence. Ilara hadn't thought. She had simply acted. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Protect the ones who cannot protect themselves. She had knelt, ignoring the icy stare she could feel boring into her back, and focused on Marco. She'd told him it was okay, that it was just a glass, and that she'd handle it. The gratitude in his eyes was a small, warm flame in the cold restaurant. She'd spoken to her manager, smoothed it over, and returned to her duties, deliberately avoiding the corner booth's gravitational pull. But now, the night was ending. The last of the diners were trickling out into the cool night air. Only Mr. Croft remained, a solitary monument to misery. The manager, a man whose spine was made of jelly, approached Ilara, his face slick with sweat. "Ilara," he whispered, his eyes darting towards the corner. He's had a bit too much. He's refusing to let the valet get him a cab. He's asking for you." A cold knot formed in Ilara's stomach. "Me? Why?" "I don't know. He just said, 'Send me the one who isn't afraid of broken glass. Please, just see what he wants. Get him out of here. I'll add a handsome bonus to your check.'" Ilara's jaw tightened. A bonus. As if her dignity had a price tag. She took a deep breath, straightened her spine, and walked towards the corner booth. Julian watched her approach. In the dim light, he could see the fatigue etched around her eyes, but also a resolve that irritated him. She didn't look intimidated. She looked like a queen approaching a troublesome courtier. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even and calm. "My manager says you're having some trouble getting home. Can I help you call a car?" He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Trouble? I don't have trouble. I have standards. Your valet smells of cheap cologne. I won't have it in my car." He gestured to the nearly empty bottle of Macallan 25. "I, however, have had a bit too much stimulation." His eyes roamed her face, looking for a crack, a flicker of fear. He found none. You'll get me home." It wasn't a request. It was a command. He expected her to refuse, to argue, to fetch the manager. He was prepared for a fight. Ilara simply looked at him for a long moment, her gaze clear and direct. She saw past the expensive suit and the gold watch. She saw a man drowning, and for a reason she couldn't fathom, she felt a flicker of something other than revulsion. It wasn't pity. It was a strange, disquieting sense of recognition. "Okay," she said. The single word threw him off balance. He had a whole speech prepared, a torrent of insults and dismissals ready to unleash. "Okay," he repeated, blinking. "Okay," she said again, a little firmer this time. She held out a hand, not to him, but towards the empty space beside him. "If you can stand, I can make sure you get to your car safely. I'll drive you." He stared at her outstretched hand, then back at her face. Who was this person? This waitress who looked at him not with the fawning greed or terrified respect he was used to, but with a simple, unnerving practicality. He felt a sudden, dizzying wave of disorientation, the scotch and his own confusion swirling into a toxic vortex. He pushed himself up from the booth, swaying slightly. He was taller than he seemed sitting down, a monolith of a man, but he felt strangely small under her steady gaze. He didn't take her hand. He didn't need to. Her presence alone was a steadying force. He stumbled past her. His pride a ragged cloak he pulled around himself. Ilara followed a few paces behind, a silent guardian in a black and white uniform. The ride to his penthouse apartment was a study in silence. The city light smeared across the windows of his Bentley, a car so expensive it felt absurd for Ilara to be driving it. Julian sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw locked. He had intended to berate her, to quiz her, to peel back her layers and find the selfish, grasping creature he knew existed in everyone. But the silence she created was impenetrable. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a weighted one, full of unspoken things. It gave him no purchase, no crack to wedge his cynicism into. He was acutely aware of her sitting beside him, her calm focus on the road, her quiet breathing. It was maddening. He lived in a sterile glass tower that scraped the clouds, a place designed to impress, not to comfort. Ilara helped him to the elevator, her hand hovering near his elbow but never touching him. When the doors opened directly into his apartment, the view of the city's glittering skyline assaulted them. It was a king's view, but the kingdom was empty. The apartment was a mausoleum of modern design, cold marble, sharp angles, and not a single personal touch. No photos on the gleaming surfaces, no books on the shelves, no clutter of a life being lived. It was the home of a ghost. He stumbled towards a leather couch and collapsed onto it. He finally looked at her, his eyes bleary. "Well?" he demanded, his voice raspy. "What are you waiting for? Payment? Take it." He gestured vaguely at a black credit card on a glass table. "Take whatever you want. Buy yourself a new spine." Ilara looked at the credit card, then back at him. She saw the challenge in his eyes, the desperate need for her to conform to his cynical view of the world. She needed the money. Lord, did she need it? An image of her grandmother's latest prescription bill flashed in her mind. Her tuition payment was a looming mountain. A few $1,000s would be a life raft in her turbulent financial sea. The temptation was a sharp, physical pang. But then she thought of her grandmother's words. Your strength is not in your voice, but in your spine. Taking his money now would be a transaction. Yes, but it would also be an admission that his view of the world was right. That kindness had a price. That she had a price. "I don't want your money, Mr. Croft," she said softly. She walked to the kitchen, a vast, untouched expanse of stainless steel, and retrieved a glass of water. She placed it on the table beside him. "You should drink this. Get some rest." She turned and walked towards the elevator, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. "Wait!" he called out, his voice suddenly stripped of its arrogance. It sounded lost. She paused at the door, her hand on the button. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Alara turned to look at him one last time. He looked pathetic, a fallen king on an empty throne, dwarfed by the opulence he had built around himself. "Because Marco has his whole life ahead of him," she said. "And he didn't deserve what you did to him tonight. And because, for a moment there, you looked like you needed help." She pressed the button, and the elevator doors slid silently shut, leaving him alone in his gilded cage. The next day, Alara found an envelope with her name on it in her locker at work. Inside was $10,000 in crisp new bills. There was no note, just the money, cold and impersonal. She felt a surge of anger. He was trying to erase the moment, to turn an act of humanity into a transaction. He was reasserting his power, reminding her of her place. She put the money back in the envelope. After her shift, she took a bus to his office building, a sleek, imposing skyscraper with his name emblazoned in silver at the top. The receptionist, a woman with a face frozen by Botox, looked at Alara's simple clothes with disdain. "I'm here to see Mr. Croft," Alara said. "It's a personal matter." "Mr. Croft doesn't see people without an appointment." "Please, just tell him it's Alara from Aria. Tell him I have something of his." The receptionist sighed, clearly annoyed, but made the call. A moment later, her eyes widened slightly. "He'll see you," she said, her tone shifting from dismissal to grudging respect. Top floor. Julian's office was even more intimidating than his apartment. It was a corner office with panoramic views, designed to make anyone who entered feel small. He was standing by the window when she came in, a silhouette against the afternoon sun. "I was wondering if you'd have the nerve," he said, turning around. He was sober today, his eyes clear and sharp, but there were dark circles under them. Alara walked to his massive mahogany desk and placed the envelope on it. "You forgot this," she said. He stared at the envelope. "It's not a payment," he said, his voice clipped. "It's a gift, an apology for my behavior. I don't accept gifts from strangers, Mr. Croft, and if you want to apologize, you should apologize to Marco." A muscle twitched in his jaw. No one spoke to him like this. No one. He was used to sycophants and enemies, not this. This quiet, unyielding integrity. He felt that same frustrating sense of being off balance. He was supposed to be in control. "What is it you want, then?" he snapped. "Everyone wants something. What's your price? A better job? A car? Name it." "I want you to understand something," she said, her voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel. "Not everything in this world is for sale. My help last night wasn't a service to be purchased. It was a choice. And my dignity isn't on the menu. You can't afford it." She turned to leave. "Stay," he commanded, the single word cracking through the air. She stopped, but didn't turn around. "I've arranged for the restaurant to give you my section, exclusively. Whenever I come in, you will be my waitress." Alara finally turned, her brow furrowed. "Why?" A slow, cold smile spread across his face. "You intrigue me, Alara from Aria. You're a puzzle. And I'm very good at solving puzzles. I want to see what it takes to make you break. I want to find your price. Sooner or later, everyone sells." Alara felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't about gratitude. It was a challenge, a declaration of war. He was going to put her under a microscope, apply pressure, and wait for the cracks to show. Her first instinct was to refuse, to quit, to run as far away from this man and his toxic world as she could. But then, she thought of her grandmother, of her tuition, of Marco's pale, frightened face. Quitting would be the easy way out. It would be letting him win. She met his cold stare with one of her own. "I'm not a puzzle, Mr. Croft. I'm a person, and you'll find I don't break easily. "We'll see," he said, the smile never leaving his eyes. "We'll see." The next few weeks were a form of psychological warfare disguised as fine dining. Julian Croft became Alara's personal ghost, a constant presence in her life. He came to Aria 3, sometimes 4 times a week, always sitting in the same corner booth, always demanding her as his server. He was a tyrant of tiny details. The water had to be a specific temperature. The steak had to be cooked to a precise, impossible-to-achieve degree of doneness. He would send back dishes for the most imagined of flaws, not with a shout, but with a quiet, disappointed sigh that was far more cutting. The other staff watched with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They gave her a wide berth, as if his toxicity might be contagious. Her manager, torn between the revenue from Julian's exorbitant bills and the tension he brought into the restaurant, offered her platitudes and bonuses, both of which she politely refused. But Julian's tests were more than just culinary. He tried to engage her in conversation, his words laced with a subtle, corrosive cynicism. He would talk about the pointlessness of ambition, the transactional nature of love, the foolishness of hope. He was probing for weakness, looking for a shared thread of despair he could pull on. "Tell me, Alara," he said one evening, swirling a glass of wine that cost more than her weekly salary. "This art history of yours? What's the end game? You spend your life studying the dead creations of dead men. For what? To teach a handful of bored teenagers who'd rather be on their phones?" Alara was in the middle of pouring his wine. She didn't falter, her hand steady. "I don't do it for them," she said, finishing the pour with a clean, practiced motion. "I do it for me. I do it because it reminds me that there's more to this world than just this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent dining room. "And what is there?" he pressed, leaning forward. "Beauty? Truth? Those are just words people use to sell paintings to rich men like me." "Maybe," she said, placing the bottle back on the table. "Or maybe they're the only things that are real. The money, the deals, the buildings, that's all temporary. But the feeling you get when you stand in front of a Rothko, the way the colors can make you feel something you don't have words for, that's permanent. That lasts." He scoffed, but he was silent for the rest of the meal. Her sincerity was a language he didn't speak, and it unnerved him. He was trying to draw her into his dark, empty world, but instead, she kept offering him glimpses of her own, a world full of light and color he had long since forgotten. He escalated his efforts. He started leaving things behind. A gold-plated lighter, a pair of expensive cufflinks. Each time Alara would have them delivered to his office the next day by a courier, with a simple typed note. "You left this at Aria." No thank you, no acknowledgement, just the return of his property. He was trying to indebt her to him, to create a ledger of favors she would one day have to repay. But she refused to play. She kept the books perfectly, maddeningly balanced. The more he tried to break her, the more he found himself breaking against the rocks of her integrity. He began to watch her, not just as a target, but as a phenomenon. He watched how she treated the other staff, the quiet words of encouragement she gave to Marco, the way she helped the kitchen staff clean up after a busy night, even though it wasn't her job. She moved through the world with a quiet grace and a deep-seated kindness that he found both infuriating and, to his horror, compelling. He was a man who built his empire by understanding people's motivations, their greed, their fear, their ambition. But he couldn't understand hers. She didn't seem to want anything from him. She just wanted to be left alone to do her job and live her life. And the more he tried to invade that life, the more he felt like he was the one being exposed. His wealth, his power, his carefully constructed persona of detached cruelty, it all felt cheap and hollow in the face of her simple, unadorned decency. He was a king with no clothes, and she was the only one who seemed to notice. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night. The restaurant was quiet, the city outside weeping against the large plate glass windows. Julian had been drinking heavily, more so than usual. He was quieter tonight, his usual barbs and tests replaced by a heavy, brooding silence. He looked haunted. He was paying his bill, his movements clumsy, when his wallet slipped from his grasp, falling open on the floor. Papers and cards scattered across the dark wood. Alara knelt to help him, her movements automatic. "I've got it, Mr. Croft." She gathered the credit cards, the receipts, the meaningless detritus of a wealthy man's life. And then she saw it. A photograph, its edges soft and worn with time. The colors faded to a pale ghost of what they once were. It was a picture of a young woman with a radiant, joyful smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. She was standing in front of a small, charming building with a sign that read, "Serafina's Kitchen." The woman in the picture looked shockingly like Alara. Not a twin, but the resemblance was undeniable. The same shaped eyes, the same curve of the mouth, the same air of open-hearted warmth. Before Alara could process the image, before she could hand it back, Julian snatched it from her fingers. His hand was trembling. For a single, unguarded moment, his mask of ironclad indifference shattered, and what lay beneath was a landscape of pure, unadulterated grief. It was a pain so raw and so deep that Alara felt the air leave her lungs. It was the look of a man who had lost everything. He shoved the photo and the rest of his belongings into his jacket pocket, threw a pile of cash on the table, and stormed out of the restaurant without a word, leaving Alara kneeling on the floor, her heart pounding. He didn't come back for a week. The restaurant felt strangely empty without his oppressive presence. The staff relaxed. The manager stopped sweating. But Alara couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. The woman's smile, the name of the restaurant, and the look in Julian's eyes. It was a look she had seen before, in the mirror, after her own parents had been taken from her in a car crash when she was a child. It was the look of a life that had been permanently fractured. When he finally returned, he was a different man. The change was subtle, but profound. He was sober. His eyes were clear, but they held a deep, resonant sadness. He didn't try to test her. He didn't complain. He just sat there, nursing a bottle of sparkling water, and watched her work. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a truce. Finally, after he had finished his meal, he spoke, his voice low and raspy, as if it hadn't been used for a long time. "Her name was Serafina," he said, not looking at her. He was staring out the window at the rain, which had started to fall again. "She was my wife." Alara stood by the table, holding a silver tray, her own heart aching with a sudden, unexpected empathy. She didn't say anything. She just listened. "She was everything," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "The light, the air, all of it. We had a dream. A small restaurant, just like this one, but ours. We were going to call it Serafina's Kitchen. We had just bought the building. We were a week away from starting renovations." He paused, taking a long, shuddering breath. "There was a drunk driver, a kid, not much older than your Marco. He ran a red light. She was killed instantly." Alara felt her own past rush up to meet her, the memory of the police officer at her grandmother's door, the sterile smell of the hospital, the crushing weight of a world suddenly devoid of her parents. "I was supposed to be with her," Julian whispered, the words like shards of glass. "I was supposed to drive her home, but I stayed late to close a deal. A big one. The one that started everything." He gestured around the restaurant at the city beyond the glass. "I built all of this empire of nonsense, because I couldn't face the silence she left behind. I thought if I filled the world with enough noise, enough money, enough power, I wouldn't have to hear it anymore. but it's always there. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. And then I saw you. You look so much like her. Not just your face, your spirit. The way you stand up for people. The way you're not afraid. It drove me mad. I wanted to hate you for it. I wanted to prove that your kindness was a lie, just like everything else. Because if it was real, then... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. If it was real, then the world wasn't the dark, empty place he had convinced himself it was. If it was real, then he had spent the last 20 years living a lie, punishing the world for a crime it didn't commit. This was the climax of their strange, tortured relationship. Not a battle of wills, but a confession. A surrender. The great, powerful Julian Croft was not a monster. He was just a man. Broken and lost. Trapped in a prison of his own making. He had built an empire on a foundation of grief, and now the walls were crumbling down around him. Ilara slowly lowered the silver tray, placing it on the table. She pulled out the chair opposite him and, for the first time, sat down. The barrier between waitress and customer, between the powerless and the powerful, dissolved. They were just two people, sitting in the quiet of a nearly empty restaurant, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts. She didn't offer him empty platitudes. She didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or, "It'll be okay." Words like that were meaningless in the face of such a cavernous grief. Instead, she shared a piece of her own brokenness. "I was 8 when my parents died," she said softly, her gaze distant. "Another car crash. For a long time I was angry at them for leaving me. I was angry at everyone who still had their parents. I wanted to break things, just to make the world feel as broken as I did." Julian looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not just the waitress, not just the ghost of his wife, but a fellow survivor. A person who had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but whole. "How did you—" he started, his voice thick with emotion. "How did you stop being angry?" "I don't think you ever stop being angry," she said, a sad, wise smile touching her lips. "Not completely. But you learn to make room for other things. My grandmother. She taught me that the best way to honor the people we've lost is to live. Truly live. To find the beauty, even when it hurts. To be kind, especially when it's hard. The anger doesn't go away, it just gets quieter. It has to make room for the light." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The only sound the gentle patter of the rain against the glass. It was a shared silence, no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a space for healing. When Julian finally stood up to leave, the stoop in his shoulders seemed less pronounced. The hard, brittle shell around him had begun to crack, not from force, but from the gentle, persistent pressure of a simple, unexpected human connection. As he walked out of Aria, he didn't look like a millionaire or a tyrant. He just looked like a man who was finally, after 20 long years, on his way home. The change in Julian Croft was not a sudden, dramatic metamorphosis. It was a slow, quiet dawn. He started coming to Aria for lunch instead of dinner, and he stopped drinking scotch. He drank sparkling water with a slice of lemon, and he always asked Ilara how her classes were going. He didn't just ask. He listened. He remembered the names of the artists she was studying and would look them up later, sending her articles he thought she might find interesting. He began to see the other staff not as furniture, but as people. He learned Marco's name and asked him about his college applications. One day, Ilara overheard Marco telling another busboy, his voice full of disbelief, that an anonymous benefactor had paid his entire first year's tuition. Ilara looked over at the corner booth, where Julian was quietly reading a newspaper. He glanced up and caught her eye, and for the first time, she saw a genuine, unforced smile on his face. It was small and hesitant, but it was real. His apologies were not made of words, but of actions. He was trying to repair the world he had spent so long trying to break. He was a man learning a new language, the language of kindness, and he was a clumsy but dedicated student. Ilara was his teacher, not through instruction, but by example. He began talking more about Serafina, not with the raw, open grief of that first night, but with a quiet, gentle reverence. He told Ilara about her laugh, about her terrible singing voice, about her dream of a restaurant where every guest felt like family. He was excavating his past, not to bury himself in it, but to find the man he was before the grief had hollowed him out. One afternoon, he asked Ilara about her own art. She was hesitant at first, but he was persistent in a new, gentle way. She finally brought in a small portfolio of her sketches and paintings. They were mostly landscapes, small moments of beauty she had captured around the city, the way the light hit a fire escape at dawn, the explosion of cherry blossoms in the park, the quiet dignity of an old man sitting on a bench. Julian looked at them for a long time, his expression unreadable. "They're beautiful," he said finally, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite place. "They're full of hope." He bought one on the spot, a small watercolor of a single stubborn weed growing through a crack in the pavement. He paid her a ridiculous amount of money for it, but this time, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like an investment in her, in the hope she represented. He told her he had started going to therapy. He was visiting his wife's grave for the first time in nearly 2 decades. The last time he went, he told Ilara, he had taken her painting with him. He had left it there, a small splash of color in a world of gray stone. He was starting to make room for the light. His redemption was a quiet, painstaking process, built one small, decent act at a time. He was rebuilding himself from the inside out, and Ilara was the silent architect of his reconstruction. She never praised him, never judged him. She simply held the space for him to change, her steady, unwavering belief in the good in people, the foundation on which he built his new life. One evening, as the restaurant was closing, Julian lingered at his table. He looked more relaxed than she had ever seen him. The lines of tension around his eyes and mouth softened. "I have something to tell you," he said, his tone serious. "Mr. Dubois, the owner of Aria, is retiring. He's selling the restaurant." Ilara's heart sank. Aria was more than just a job. For all its flaws, it was a community. It was her stability, the engine that powered her dreams. "What's going to happen to everyone?" she asked, the fear evident in her voice. "That's the other thing," Julian said, his gaze steady. "Dubois has been running this place into the ground for years. It's deeply in debt. He was planning on selling to a corporate group that was going to gut it, fire the staff, and turn it into another soulless chain restaurant. He was going to announce it next week." The news hit Ilara like a physical blow. Marco's tuition, the kitchen staff who had families to feed, her own carefully balanced financial ecosystem. It was all about to be wiped out. She looked around the dining room, at the familiar tables and chairs, and felt a profound sense of loss. "That's horrible," she whispered. "Yes, it is," Julian agreed, "which is why I bought it." Ilara stared at him, stunned into silence. You bought Aria." "I finalized the deal this afternoon," he said simply. He saw the fear flash in her eyes. The fear that he was just another rich man playing with people's lives. He held up a hand. "Before you say anything, I want you to know this isn't the old me. This isn't a power play. This was the final test." Was his transformation real? Or was this just another way for him to own and control the world around him? His next words would be the proof. "I'm not a restaurateur," he said. "I'm a builder. And for the past 20 years, I've been building the wrong things. Empty towers, hollow monuments to my own ego. I want to build something real now. Something that matters. He leaned forward, his eyes full of a passion she had never seen before. Serafina's dream. It wasn't just about food. It was about creating a place of refuge, a place of warmth and community, a place where people felt seen. That's what you do, Ilara. You see people. You saw me when I was invisible to myself. You see Marco, you see the cooks, you see the dishwashers. You understand the soul of a place. He took a deep breath. I want to give it to you. Ilara's mind went blank. Give it to me? I want to give you the restaurant, he repeated, his voice firm. Not as a gift, as a legacy. My money, your vision. I will finance everything, the renovations, a new profit-sharing plan for the staff, everything. But you will run it. You will own it. It will be your place. You can fill it with art, with music, with whatever you want. You can make it the place you and Serafina both dreamed of. He looked at her, his expression a mixture of hope and trepidation. There's only one condition. You have to promise me you'll never lose that quiet strength, that integrity. It's the most valuable thing in this world, and I need to know it's safe. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. This wasn't about him saving her. It was about them saving each other. He was offering her not just a restaurant, but a future. A chance to build a life on her own terms, to create a space that reflected her own values, her own spirit. She thought of her grandmother. She thought of the long, tiring shifts, the condescending customers, the constant struggle to stay afloat. And then she thought of the look in Julian's eyes, the look of a man who had finally found his way out of the dark. I promise, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The resolution was not a storybook ending. It was something quieter, truer, and far more beautiful. The restaurant closed for a month for renovations. When it reopened, it was no longer called Aria. A simple, elegant sign now hung above the door. Serafina's. It was different inside. The walls were painted in warm, inviting colors. Local art, much of it curated by Ilara from her fellow students, adorned the walls. There was a small stage in the corner where musicians played soft jazz on the weekends. The menu was simpler, more soulful, but the quality was impeccable. The staff was the same, but they moved with a new lightness, a new sense of pride and ownership. They weren't just employees anymore. They were partners. Ilara was no longer a waitress. She was the heart and soul of the place. She moved between the tables not with a tray, but with a warm smile and a genuine word for everyone. She had finished her degree, but she had found her true calling not in the hallowed halls of a museum, but in the lively, bustling community she had built. Julian Croft was a regular. He still sat in his corner booth, but it was no longer a fortress. It was a vantage point from which he could watch the life and warmth of the world he had helped create. He never interfered, never gave orders. He was just a quiet patron, a man at peace with his past. He would often dine alone, but he was no longer lonely. He was surrounded by the legacy of the wife he had lost, and the quiet waitress who had shown him the way back to himself. Forgiveness was a complicated, messy thing. Ilara had never formally forgiven him for his cruelty, and he had never formally asked for it. The forgiveness was in the restaurant itself, in the second chances it represented for everyone who worked there. It was in the shared glance between Ilara and Julian across the crowded room, a glance of mutual respect, of shared history, of a profound and unlikely friendship. The story of the waitress and the millionaire became a quiet legend among the staff, a reminder that the most powerful transformations often begin with the smallest acts of courage and compassion. It was a testament to the fact that true wealth is not measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings, but in the lives you touch. and the hope you can inspire. And sometimes, in the darkest of rooms, all it takes is one person who is not afraid of the broken glass to let in a little bit of light. Ilara had not just been given a restaurant. She had been given a chance to prove her grandmother right. Strength wasn't in the voice, but in the spine. And hers had proven strong enough to hold up the sky.